Well, here we are. Zuby, good to see you again. And thanks for coming on Based Podcast. Your music's been a feature for a while. I think you started back in your uni days when you were at Oxford, I think 2006, and you had some albums and it took off. And so you've had that presence in there. But I mean, from your point of view, there's obviously social media and your public speaking, and you write a lot. You've got a great Substack as well, and your podcast, Real Talk with Zuby. But the music's pretty special, I think, to you in terms of getting a message across, because it's sort of that, I think the left have used it so well for so long, music. And, I think conservatives are showing that it can be done from the other side of the fence as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I think I'm 38 years old, but if I just think over the course of my own lifetime, I think one of the big mistake that conservatives all across the West have made, and I think this started well before I was born, but it's essentially kind of like giving up the arts and the culture and all of the creative endeavors, as well as academia, pretty much to liberals and progressives, and just saying, okay, we're not really going to be involved in that. They can have that. And I think that a lot of what we've been seeing is the sort of consequences of that. I think it's kind of fascinating how over the past decade, so many people who are not inherently political, or certainly not political first and foremost, I'm absolutely not. Many of us have been roped into the culture war, for lack of a better term, in various ways. And oftentimes it wasn't, I never set out thinking like, I was just an independent rapper in the UK. Like I was pretty happy just, making my music and entertaining people. My music is not especially politically charged or anything like that. I just wanted to entertain people and be creative and uplift and motivate people. But then things started swinging in a certain way, particularly after 2015, the kind of 2015 to 2016, 2017, we really started to see the mainstreaming of what people now call wokeness. At the time, people more referred to it as social justice warriors. You used to hear that term a lot, social justice, SJWs, that type of terminology. And so a lot of people from all sorts of different fields, whether it's from tech, entrepreneurship, music, arts, like all of these different fields, somehow, people who are not on board with the whole thing. Exact same thing happened with COVID, by the way. A lot of people who just were not on board with the agenda we just kind of found ourselves like, hey, well, I've got to say something. If no one else is going to point out the absurdity of men competing in women's sports, I'm going to point it out. Like, this is insane. It's not even because I'm particularly passionate about women's sports or something, but I'm just like, wait, what is going on where this is being allowed to happen? This is not a good precedent. When, 2 years, and then 1 year later, across all of these countries that are supposed to be freedom oriented, whether it's Australia, New Zealand, the UK, Canada, parts of the USA, parts of Europe, and all of a sudden you're locking people in your homes, you're forcing people to wear face coverings, you're trying to eventually mandate vaccines on people. I was just like, this is not right. And if I think that something is not right and it has real negative repercussions for society and for our future, then maybe it's just my personality type. I feel like I have to say something. I wish I didn't have to fight a lot of these fights. I'd rather live a more sort of peaceful existence and just make music and hang out with my family and my friends and travel and so on. But sometimes things get pushed in such a way where I think if you are someone who is wired a certain way and you do have strong principles, then it becomes incumbent on you to say something, whether or not it's your quote unquote place.
Yeah. And I think, I feel exactly the same. And it doesn't matter necessarily whether you're in politics or you're in the, the entertainment industry, or, you're just a mum or a dad or whatever. I think that's what we weren't getting enough of during COVID, was people speaking up. And the system had actually actively shut people down. Here in Australia, it shut the doctors down, and the media shut the rest of us down in many ways. So it was incumbent on those of us that did have a platform, I think, to say something. And I agree with you. I ironically would have liked to have seen less tribalism in politics, but I feel like it's grown. I mean, it's certainly in Australia, it's a completely different playing field than it was decades ago, and I assume that's the same in the UK as well. I mean, do you think it feels to me like tribalism is hyper out of control now in politics, and the left and the right are kind of almost, I don't know, they've almost reached a point where they're unreconcilable. I mean, that's the case in the UK too, I would have thought.
I think I don't think either of our countries, the UK and Australia respectively, I don't think either of them are as polarized as the USA is.
Yeah.
I think the USA is the most polarized politically and culturally in this sense, which is a shame. I think there's many different reasons for it. But, I wouldn't want to say that it's irreconcilable because I don't think that it is. And like I said, I do think we're in a much better position now in 2025 than we were in certainly any time from, let's say, 2016 to about 2023. I think that period seemed more polarized to me and more just ridiculous to me than where we are right now. I don't know which way it's going to trend. It's a bit difficult. I think the sort of woke era was about a decade. I'd put it kind of like 2020, let's say 2015 to 2023, 2024. I'd say that particular decade, that was a specific era. There were a whole bunch of things going on. Obviously, we had the mainstreaming of social media and smartphones and technology wise, all of a sudden, for the first time in human history, billions of people all over the earth are able to communicate in real time. And there's trolling going on, and there's manipulation, and there's this, and there's this. And people don't really know how to handle all of this. For the first time, politicians are, using social media. We've got podcasts, all of this new media, like all of that sort of happened at the same time. So there's technological factors, political factors, social factors, cultural factors, just a lot of stuff going on. And then to fan the flames of what was already pretty crazy, you then throw in, I don't know, I call it the scamdemic, but you throw in everything that happened with COVID, less the disease and more the response to it. And this wasn't just in one country. Most countries around the entire globe all went through this strange thing. Billions of people, we all got dragged through, not for 2 months, not for 2 weeks, but for 2-3 years. We all just get dragged through this very strange, even more polarized period. A lot of people are discriminated against. People are having fallouts with their friends. If they didn't fall out over Trump or Brexit, now they're falling out over mandates and lockdowns and masks and vaccines. And it was just a very, very, very rough period. And now we're out of it. Now we're out of that. And I don't really know where we go next, but I would like to think that this decade is going to be better than the previous one. And I see a lot of signs to me that indicate that, but it doesn't, it's not going to happen just by magic. I think we need leaders. We need leaders in all sorts of spaces, and we need, I don't know, we need more critical thinking. We need more honest conversations. And I'm glad to see that the power of the legacy media has diminished greatly over the past 10 years. And there's now this rise, what we're doing right now, 20 years ago, like this, 15 years ago, even, this didn't really exist. So I think that it's wonderful that we have these opportunities, and people who are interested in seeking and speaking the truth, no matter where they are in the world, we can connect with each other. We can try to make sense of things, agree, disagree, talk through issues. And I often say that it's impossible to solve a problem unless you're allowed to talk about it. And that has been massively stifled externally and internally over the past several years. But now we have more freedom to speak. 2025 to me, I know I've been on social media for 20 years, which is crazy, since 2004. And the way it is now, it feels more similar to how it felt, let's say, around 2012 or 2013. It's not as censorious. It's not as great. There was the sort of good days. I'd say like 2004 to about 2015. Social media was, it was pretty free. Like, people weren't self-censoring so much. People weren't getting banned left, right, and center for whatever. People weren't constantly at each other's throats. And then from about 2015 onward, especially from 2016 onward, it really sort of ramped up a lot. And then we started to have the censors come in because people started to realize, hey, this is a powerful tool. So the government needs to step in. And again, not one government, but all these different governments around the world creating legislation, trying to ban platforms, trying to do this, trying to do that. And I think we're kind of on the other end of that now, where it's just like, you know what? And Elon buying X obviously is a massive factor here. But X is less censorious now than it was a few years ago. YouTube is less censorious now than it was a few years ago. Facebook and Instagram, all the Meta apps, are less censorious now than they were just a few years ago. So to me, that's all positive. That's trending in a better direction. So that's something that I think we should have some optimism about.
Yeah, we should. I mean, it certainly is less, less closed. I think many of those platforms, but of course, the capability is still there for that censorship to emerge again if we get another incident that governments want us to take a particular view on. I mean, COVID was the big wake up call for me on a lot of this stuff generally, but certainly in terms of the censorship on social media. I mean, we saw it play out so drastically, and I assume if X had been the platform that it is today, it would have been less of that, and it has been so important, but it's still there, isn't it? I mean, the conditions are still there for that censorship to take place. And in fact, in Australia, over the last 12 to 18 months in Parliament, we've been fighting some of us have been fighting a lot of fights about freedom of speech and censorship. We had misinformation laws, which were pulled by the Labor government here because they just didn't have the support from both sides, actually, as it turned out. But we've also had bans on social media for kids and, all sorts of other incursions, which I expect when our next Parliament sits, we'll get as well. But, I mean, we hear stories out of the UK of, really serious incursions on free speech in the United Kingdom. We see clips of people getting hauled out of their homes because of things they put online, and thousands of arrests, and it's hard to decipher what's real and what's not. But what is the situation like in the UK on social media? I mean, are people really getting charged, arrested, and convicted for mean tweets?
Yeah, well, I mean, I do know a few people personally who it has happened to over the couple of years. Based on what I have seen online, I've heard that there are about 30 arrests per day. It's running at around 1,000 per month, I believe, according to the data that I've seen. I don't live in the UK. I haven't lived in the UK for 4 years now. So I don't have, I go there often. I spend a good amount of time there, but I don't know all the details. But 1,000 arrests per month over social media posts. Let's let's be charitable, and I will assume that some of those are things that you probably should investigate. People, I will assume some of those are actual terroristic threats or direct calls to violence or something like that. I'm sure that's some percentage, but I also know that a large chunk of it is just people saying things that are perhaps obnoxious or are perhaps a bit offensive or are perhaps this or that. But look, I often think of things in terms of opportunity cost, and even aside from the pure freedom of speech angle, the UK has real problems to deal with. Okay, we're not the UK is not at a point where there is zero robbery and zero rape and zero assault and zero murders. Like maybe if a stage is reached where there's literally no violent theft, no crime, no damage to private property, anything like that, then even then I wouldn't support anyone going after people for their tweets or their social media posts. But the police are limited in what they can do. So every pound, every minute, every hour that is spent on nonsense like trying to get people in trouble over misgendering or saying this or saying that, that is directly taking away from the capacity for the police to police actual crimes. And how are the police funded? They're taxpayer funded. That is just the citizens of the UK, everyday normal people. The police exists to keep people physically safe. That's the point of the police ultimately. And so I just think they need to go back to the drawing board on many, many things and kind of go back to remembering why certain entities exist. It might kind of sound strange. I feel this with politics often. It can happen with the law enforcement, with healthcare professionals, and so on. Kind of going back to the drawing board of like, okay, why does this thing exist, and is it being used towards that purpose? Because there's this idea of like concept creep, right? You can start with a certain idea. It can happen in a business, right? You can start out, okay, we're a business that makes pencils, and over time, you start to make pens, and then maybe you start doing this, and then 10 years down the line, you're involved in all sorts of things. It's like, wait, actually, what is our core mission? What's our main thing we're meant to be doing? And it happens in politics as well. And I think oftentimes people forget that politicians are their salaries are paid by the everyday citizens. So there's supposed to be public service. There's supposed to be representation. It's not just meant to be a sort of pageant or a way to get famous or a way to enrich yourself or a way to sort of parade around as a celebrity or something like that. It's like, no, that's not what it's meant to be. So I think the people in power often forget that. But I also think just the everyday people often forget that. And if we can kind of come back to the core of it, then things will just be more reasonable and sensible. Because I'll tell you what frustrates me, Alex, with all of the things that are happening in the West is that it's really self-inflicted. That's the thing that I think is bothering me, that bothers me so much. In most of the world and in most of human history, when there were these types of conflicts or there was polarization or there were, battles going on, it was oftentimes like, an outside invader is trying to come in and take over and physically dominate and so on. An army's rolling in, we got to go to war. And when I look at countries like Australia, the UK, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, the biggest enemy to them, it's not Russia, it's not Iran, it's not China. So it's yourselves. You're doing this to yourselves. Nobody is trying to invade Canada. All the problems that Canada is dealing with, they are domestically created. The problems the UK is dealing with, they are domestically created. No one, as far as I'm aware, is trying to roll in and take over Australia. So the problems that are happening, it's just this internal issue, and I find that even more frustrating because it's easier to understand, like, if okay, like there's just this unpredictable outside force which is forcing all of these things to happen. But in these cases, it's just like, hey, we've made a huge amount of progress in many good ways. We're relatively comfortable economically. People are doing pretty well overall, certainly by global or historical standards. And it's like people get bored and they just start creating problems instead of perhaps sort of enjoying the fact that, hey, cool, like we've made some good achievements here.
It feels like, I agree with you. It feels like, despite having had a pretty good run over the last 100 years, the Anglosphere, the West, for whatever you want to call it, has never been more miserable. It feels like there's this inherent sense of self-loathing, which has driven some of these problems as well. This sort of tutting about environmentalism and, whatever it is, past deeds of, colonialism, whatever it is. But it feels like people are not proud anymore. Certainly in Australia, the young generation seem as, lacking in national pride as they've ever been. Do you think that's a natural swing, through cultures that have, have had a good run for, had it too good for too long, as we would say?
I think there is some historical precedent for that. I'm not enough of a historical expert to, I know people have the comparisons to the Roman Empire. That's the most common one. But I do think that on an individual and a collective and on a national level, there's always a risk of, there can be problems created by comfort and by success. If you are even just on an individual level, right? If you have, I don't know, if you give someone $10 million or pounds, they've won the lottery. That in itself creates problems. It creates new issues. It can create issues of complacency, issues of mismanagement, issues of indulgence, lack of self-control. And I think that, yeah, this is something that we're struggling with. I also think one point is that the more equal the more fair and equal a society becomes in terms of the law and in terms of social attitudes and in terms of culture, I would also make the argument that the less obvious the purpose of the left or progressives becomes. And I would point out the fact that within our own lifetime, in the first places and in the first times, pretty much, well, no, not pretty much, in all of human history, we actually have reached a point of equality and fairness under the law. I could be wrong here, but I don't think you could point out to me a law on the books in the UK, in Australia, in the US and Canada, a law that explicitly discriminates against a certain group of people. I don't think you can find that law. And in all of the history of these countries, those laws have existed up until quite recently. And I think that with that has happened, I think this is part of why the left came off the hinges around the mid 2010s, because they kind of have, they fought all the fights worth fighting, right? All the fights that are worth fighting. Before you could always say, hey, look, I don't know, go back, literally just rewind to 70 years ago. Let's go back to the 1950s, and let's look at the laws and the general cultural attitudes that exist in the USA, in Australia. You can find laws on the books that say, hey, this group of people is not allowed to vote. This group of people can be discriminated against in housing. This group of people is not, and even if it's not on the law, the general cultural attitudes, there's various forms of segregation going on, or there's this, or there's a, all these isms that we talk about, the isms and the phobias, racism, sexism, homophobia, like all of it, like it's not hard to find like real and vicious examples of these things throughout history, sometimes codified. And lo and behold, good job liberals, by the way, like good job liberals. Like we reached a point where it's like, okay, we actually have like fairness and equality across the, and I think there are now just millions of people who are naturally wired towards activism and who consider themselves progressives and so on, who they don't really know what to do now. It's kind of like, okay, what's the next thing? And I think that's why they grabbed onto the trans thing, right? They went crazy with the whole transgender thing, because it's like, well, okay, I mean, they even got like same-sex marriage legalized. It's like, well, where do we go now? Oh, how about we we invent a new oppressed group, and we just run with this. I think it's why the BLM thing went so crazy, because it's like, people would want to imagine that, oh my gosh, we're still, in their brains, they're still living in 1925, you know? But society has moved on, culture has moved on, politics has moved on, but they're still fighting these fights in their head. And then they go out in the street and they start creating the problem. That's the craziest thing. If you are an anti-racist activist, the worst thing that can happen to you is that racism disappears, because then you're out of a job. If you are a hardcore feminist and that's your identity and you fought this thing for decades, the worst thing that could happen to you is actually like the sex is being treated fairly and equally, because it's like, well, what's your fight now? And I just think there are millions of those people and they don't know what they're fighting. And if their dragons don't exist, they start to invent the dragons. They start to create the dragons just so that they can go out and they can fight them. And that's what I've been seeing a lot of over the last decade in particular. So, I often like to ask people who call themselves, who strongly identify as liberal or even as progressive. I often like to ask them what the world or what their country would have to look like for them to be conservatives. Like what would be the point where you're like, oh, okay, we have fairness and we have equality, and I'm just happy to conserve this. And oftentimes they don't have an answer. They've never thought about it.
Yeah, and it explains the whole phenomenon of what is basically cult-like behaviour in the climate wars. It explains what we saw during COVID. I mean, I always say I can't imagine a time where the left were cheering more for big pharma corporations than that. It's bizarre, and yet it sort of explains the whole shift, doesn't it? I mean, it's right there in front of us.
Yeah, it was a very strange time. I think, Alex, there are some people who really like. I don't think I know this. There are some people who just really like to have a cause to fight. If they don't have a fight and they don't have this righteous anger and righteous indignation, they don't feel comfortable. They don't feel happy. They don't feel useful. And so it kind of sounds strange that you have people who like to constantly be outraged and who want to constantly be doing activism and so on. But this personality type does exist. And I think it's existed all throughout history, and it's manifested in different ways. And I think that now, in an increasingly secular, increasingly polarized, increasingly politically charged society, the way that we've been seeing that manifesting is through the, at the extreme ends, the Antifa types and the hardcore BLM types, or the, crazy, like the super hardcore pro Palestine people. You can even say on the flip side, the super hardcore pro Zionist people. Just whatever the cause is, animal activism, climate activism, people gluing themselves to pavements to try to stop the sun being hot, going out and throwing paint on paintings, and, just whatever it takes to get the attention and to be like, hey, look at me. I'm fighting the good fight. it's a very annoying personality type. I don't tend to get I don't tend to get on with that type of person, but they exist, and I think the universities in particular encourage and embolden that, and I think that's why with a lot of young people on lots of these college campuses in particular, again, it doesn't whatever the cause is, they'll sort of latch onto it, and the flags and the slogans and the signs and the chants, all of it comes out.
So it sort of reminds me a bit of, I remember you wrote, you did Substack, and I think you posted it again on X recently about the 20 things you learned during COVID. Because, for me, it was the same thing. As I said earlier, it was a really instructive period on human nature because it was the pressure cooker of what was going on. But one of the things you said, I think on there was, might have been the first one, was that people would rather be with the majority, with the troops, than they would be right. So it's easier to be going with the flow in a sense. I mean, there were a whole host of things. I thought it was a really good post, actually, but that was the thing that stuck out. And also, to tie back to what you were just saying then as well, that everything's political now, where it necessarily wasn't. And whatever the issue is, there's a flag for it or an emoji for it. And, I can now pretty well tell what someone's made of by their Twitter handle. I mean, if you've got, a sort of a syringe with 6 times and, flags in it and what I can pretty well sum someone up from their kind of the clan they roll with. But, that it was, I mean, COVID really did do that, did it? Sort of put the acid test on a whole heap of those things. And there were a whole heap of others. I think you said that conspiracy theorists are sometimes better researched than anyone else, So, I mean, it's true.
Well, there's always, there's oftentimes not much social reward for being early. In fact, oftentimes it's punished. So if there's like a big situation going on and you have a counter narrative take or perspective on it, and you're the person who just says it early. I've experienced this multiple times, from my criticism of BLM to my criticism of the lockdowns and all the COVID policy. I mean, I put up a poll on my own X account the other day of I wrote, now that we're several years past it, what do you think did more overall damage, COVID or the response to COVID? 97% of people said the response. 97%. Now, of course, that's my own audience. It's going to skew a bit, but 97.3, that is an absolute landslide, right? And that poll posted in June 2020 or even in June 2021, it would not have looked that way. And so, and now people, everybody I know pretty much is happy to say, okay, yeah, the response wasn't that great. It didn't all make sense. There were overreactions, but I have a long memory, man. Like we can just think back to three or 4 years ago and think of what people were saying, how they were acting, what they were doing. And, it's kind of a shame that it has to go that way. And something I have realized is oftentimes people don't feel the pain or feel that they need to do something until it somehow affects them directly. That's another sad thing, I guess, just about human beings. You can kind of warn people and you can tell them and you can say, but if it doesn't personally affect them or their child or somebody very close to them, they oftentimes won't realize the sort of magnitude of the situation. If we're here warning people about the risk of censorship and the danger of banning people from social media platforms or this or that, or police coming in and kicking people's doors down and dragging them away in handcuffs because of most people will, maybe mentally they'll be like, yeah, maybe that's not great, but they won't really feel that strongly about it. But I can guarantee you, if their mother, father, brother, son, daughter is the one being dragged away in the handcuffs because of a social media post, that person is now activated. That person is now, hey, we need to stand up to this. We need to fight something. And that's just how it goes. People need to sort of feel the fire a bit themselves. And I think, by the way, this is why things are starting to trend in a better direction, because I think so many people in all of these different categories, whether we're talking about some of the racial narratives or the transgender narratives or the COVID narratives or this, and I think it hit home in some way, shape, or form for enough people at this point that the average person is a bit more awake and enlightened and aware of, oh, okay, maybe in 2018, they didn't see the problem of made up pronouns and made up genders and teaching kids in schools about this. In fact, some of them would have denied it even existed, right? They'd be like, hey, you're being a conspiracy theorist. Come on. It's not going to go that far. I had this conversation myself with people. I have conversation threads on WhatsApp from 2017, 8 years ago, warning people of like, hey, this is where this is going. All of this, like it's going too far. You're going to start having men competing in women's sports and this, and people are like, come on, Zuby, like, what are you even talking about? Because it sounds absurd, right? Doesn't it sound silly? I'm sure the 2000, the 2010 version of you would not have believed if I told you all the things that were going to happen in 2020, 2021, you'd be like, come on, man. Like, what are you talking about? Come on, that's not going to happen. And then it does. And suddenly people are like, oh,
then?
why?
What's your tip for where it goes? What's the next thing then? I want to go out on a limb and tell me what the next ludicrous, because I want to know. I want to be ahead of the curve for once.
Okay, I will give you something. And I have actually talked about this for a couple of years, but it wasn't as much of a concern then. I see that I think in the next few years, certainly in the next decade, but I'd say even in the next 5 years, we're going to actually see a lot more fragmentation on what we call the right. That's what I think is going to happen. So over the past decade, the left went through its massive overcorrection and the splintering of people who are like on the sort of far progressive end versus the people who are what we'd maybe just call like sane, normal liberals, right? Like there was this sort of splintering out and they kept kind of outflanking each other. I actually see the same thing happening on the right side of the aisle. I see, I think that I can see a couple potential dividing lines. I can see a dividing line between the Christian conservatives and the more secular right-wingers. I can see a particular dividing line happening between the sort of pro-Israel, pro-Zionist right and the anti-Zionist or perhaps more like isolationist right. And even in terms of the identity politics, again, the left has been doing the identity politics for the past decade plus. I'm starting to see a lot more identity politics starting to pop up on certain sides of the right. And I think that there are going to be fractures increasingly developing between those different factions and a lot more infighting between the people who think, hey, we should be going this way and people who think we should be going that way. So that is actually going to be that's going to be my big prediction. I don't know exactly what's going to look like.
I reckon you're right.
Okay, yeah.
I reckon you're right, and the reason I say that is that ultimately politics is pendulous by nature, isn't it? So there are swings and roundabouts, and as you described, the things that we saw out of the left, where there really was that. I mean, you can see it in our own Green Party here in Australia. That the Greens as a movement used to be very environmentalist, like the older model were very, and I think very tied to that movement. Whereas the new model now, the new Greens that are coming through. Like through the ranks, the rank and file are all of a sudden identity politics based, but also geopolitical based. They're all pro-Palestine, and they're all, all this sort of stuff, which really has nothing to do with the environment at all. It's an environmental party. Back to the topic about what is the institution actually designed for. And so you can see that fracture will happen when the ascendancy comes through. A lot of the kids, of course, that are growing up, and I think a lot of the young men in particular now, I think, are shifting back to the right a little bit, and that brings with it a new breed. So it'll be interesting to see that. I see a bit of, I see hope and trouble as well on the horizon, but I'm encouraged by the fact that young people are sort of finding, I guess, strength back in the conservative movement. There certainly seems to be, particularly young men who, have been told forever and a day in the West that they're toxic and they're all violent offenders waiting to happen. I'm seeing here in Australia a bit of a pushback, in terms of conservative politics there.
Yeah,
so.
you bring up an interesting point, Alex, and there's also the flip side of that, which is that young women are trending harder to the left. And I think that if I extrapolate that down the line a few decades, I'll tell you one more prediction I think is going to happen is I actually think the battle of the sexes is going to get worse in the West. I think it's already in a bad place. And I think it's going to actually get a lot worse. I think it's going to trend in the South Korea direction. I don't want this to happen, by the way. Like none of this is me wanting any of this to happen, but I think that if men are shifting more to the right and young women are shifting more to the left, actually that doesn't bode well for the future because there's already a lot of mistrust between young men and young women, and there's all this bizarre dating culture and apps and social media. It's a very different landscape to what it was 10 and let alone 20 years ago. Um, and there's not that much good guidance out there. And I think in that generation, I don't know. I mean, I hope I'm wrong here. I hope I'm wrong. But I do think that the issues of relationships and marriage and family formation, I don't see that. I don't see the negative trend reversing on that for a while. I think the birth rates are going to continue dropping. I think the amount of single childless people is going to continue increasing in all of these countries. And I think that one actually, it's going to be many, many decades until you see the real serious repercussions of that. Countries like Japan and South Korea, right now, they are experiencing the consequences of all that stuff happening over the decades. And that is a civilizational level problem because ultimately, like, we can debate all these other things. We can talk about the economy and we can talk about politics and culture and society. But as human beings, as animals, if men and women are not liking each other enough to couple up and make more human beings, then that is actually the civilizational problem, isn't it? Like beyond everything else, if that's not even happening, then, fast forward 1 century or 2 centuries, if that doesn't get reversed, like you're really in trouble. I mean, South Korea, to give you an idea, I don't know if you know this, Alex, but are you aware of like this, how low the South Korean birth rate is?
Yeah, I know it's low. I don't know how low it is, but I know the problem
Okay.
exists there in Japan as well.
Okay, yeah. I mean, I've done a whole podcast on this, and okay, so of course, maintenance is 2.1. So to maintain a population without immigration, every woman on average needs to have let's say 2 children. South Korea is 0.7. So if you think we're worried about Australia and the UK and US, all of those I think are around 1.5, 1.6. South Korea is less than half of that. So what that means in practical terms is at the current rate, for every 100 South Koreans that exist right now, there will be 4 great-grandchildren. Think about that. Think about that. So that's the trajectory
what's caused
currently
that?
on.
Like, this can't be just simply StarCraft alone, can it? It can't be. Like it's got to be, online gaming.
Yeah.
It's got to be something else. Like, what's done it?
I have very little insight into the inner workings of South Korea. I've never been to the country. I only know a couple of people who are from there. But what I've heard from the people who I have asked, I know I have got a couple followers who live there. But what I've heard is basically all of the things that people say about our nations as to the cause of this issue or what's happening. It seems like all of that, but way more amplified and much further along. So the economic issues, the extreme feminism. I don't know if you've heard of what they call like the 4B movement or something like that. Basically, women swearing off, almost like the female version of MGTOW. Are you familiar with MGTOW, like men going their own way?
No.
Who just like...
No.
Okay, it's like a group of men who kind of just... It's called MGTOW, but essentially these are guys who have just written off... Basically, they've written off women. They're not going to date. They're probably not going to have long-term relationships. They're certainly not going to get married. In most cases, they don't want to have children. They've just kind of like resigned. You know what? Women are not worth it. It's not worth the hassle. Marriage is not worth the hassle. Kids, like all this, like I'm just going to go my own way and do my own thing. Of course, you also have like, the whole dual income, no kids thing. Of course, you've got like feminists who also have this mentality. But in South Korea, there's a relatively prominent movement of women who have just basically sworn off men. We're not going to date them. We're not going to marry them. We're certainly not going to have their children. We're going to just focus on it's like, imagine like the most like hardcore version of like, the hardcore worst version of feminism you can imagine. And that's basically like where it's gone. And what I've heard, there's just a lot of animosity. I don't know why. I don't know the reasons for this, but apparently there's just a lot of animosity between men and women. the economic situation is, maybe it's even harder to buy a house there and even harder to raise kids and so on. And so for these reasons, I'm sure there must be some unique cultural things that are going on there that are different to what's happening in the West. I'm not privy to that. I'd love to have a conversation with someone who's really clued into it to know. But I think that if we're not careful, that's where our nations could be. That's where they could be headed. And to me, that's like, I don't worry about a lot of things. But that is one issue where I'm like, actually, if there's something that could kind of like sneak up on people over the decades and over the next century or two, that's sort of like really, really, and I'm sure you see, like, Elon Musk talks about this issue constantly. It's part of why he's so big on robotics, because he's like, we're going to need robots to fill in for the lack of human beings. And that's not the future I want. I quite like humans, as frustrating as we can be. I don't, I don't really want a future where the population is
I'm not
30% of what
I'll tell you right now, I'm not having a robot in my house because it will wake me up in the middle of the night and kill me because of something I said jokingly to it. It won't get it. I'm not doing it. So
yeah, but a lot of people would. That's the thing.
Before I just it's and just on that subject, on the subject of procreation, you have just had your firstborn, I think relatively recently, a couple of months, 2 months?
No, a couple of weeks.
Couple of weeks, right. So you are presumably about, what is it, like 9 a.m., 9:30 or almost 10 a.m. there, so you presumably have had no sleep. Yeah,
it's man, it's been awesome. It's been awesome. It's challenging, of course. I knew it would be. I mean, I'm blessed to have been an uncle times 10 before I became a father. So I've seen all of my older siblings go through the process and lots of my friends and so on. So I don't think it caught me off guard in the way that it does many new dads. But at the same time, of course, it's challenging, but it's beautiful. It's fun. I've got a son. He looks just like a mini version of me without the beard, and he's great. It's fun. It's been very life enhancing, and I'm excited to just embrace everything that comes with it, man. The good, the bad, the ups and downs. It's my life is now changed forever, and it's beautiful. Like it's been good. It's been good.
Yeah. Well, I mean, congratulations. It is a great ride. I have to say, I've done it twice, and I was the same. I had uncle duties under the belt beforehand, so you think that sort of prepares you for most of it. I considered myself an expert before it happened, and then only took about 24 hours to find out that I didn't know what I was doing. But that's pretty normal as well. So, yeah. No, it's good. Well, look, thanks very much for. Have we lost you? Have we lost you?
I am still here. My camera just died.
No, it's all right. We can hear you anyway. It doesn't matter. That's a great way. No, we'll AI it in with you saying something outrageous or something like that. No, we won't. Well, thanks for taking the time. Anyway, it's great to catch up. And are we going to see you in Australia again anytime soon, or any plans to come back?
Well, get me an invitation for an event. I'd be happy to speak at another CPAC or similar event. So get me a booking and I'll be there.
All right, we'll do it. Well, thanks again. Thanks for taking the time. Great to catch up, and all the best with the podcast and everything, the public speaking and the Substack, and you're doing great stuff. So, and the music. So thanks for everything you're doing, and all the best.
Thank you, Alex. I appreciate it. You too.